For almost the past 30 years, the Tales of franchise has managed to carve out its own avid fanbase amongst JRPG fans. The series has seen its own fair share of ups and downs, successes and failures with varying qualities of titles throughout the years. But to go through those phases, a franchise must first have a beginning. Tales of Phantasia may not be the most popular title or hold up as well compared to its future successors, but as the one that started it all, it deserves respect for delivering a fantasy game that was unlike those that came before it. While there was no shortage of JRPGs on the Super Famicom, Tales of Phantasia really managed to stand out due to just how hard they pushed the console to its limits. Not only were the graphics incredibly detailed for the time, but the game also had voice acting, which wasn't a common feature for most titles. The characters would speak aloud their special moves, and important cutscenes would be narrated throughout the story. On top of that, the game had an opening lyrical theme song which really added to the feeling of a fully realized product. But probably the thing that made it stand head and shoulders above other JRPGs was its linear motion battle system. You weren't restricted to turn-based combat. You took control of one of the characters and could act freely in real time while all the others were acting independently as well. Tales of Phantasia was the first game in history to introduce this battle system, and every other Tales title since has used it. The game has definitely left its mark on the gaming world and undeniably on Tales fans. While the Tales of series is popular in its own respect, part of the reason Phantasia may not have gotten as popular as it could have was due to not actually having gotten an official release at the right time. The Super Famicom version was never translated outside of Japan, and even when it got a remake for the PlayStation, that version was also Japanese exclusive. It wasn't until 2006, 11 years later, after the success of Symphonia in the West, that a port for the Game Boy Advance was made so American audiences were able to experience this title. And unfortunately, it wasn't great. Not only were the graphics and performance worse than all iterations that came before it, but there was also a ton of translation errors that really dragged down the experience and showed that a proper localization wasn't what you were getting when you played it. Fortunately, there have been tons of fan efforts and fan translations that have allowed this game to be given the opportunity to stand on its own two legs. Since Symphonia was the title which initially got me into the franchise and the one that I first made a timeline video on, it's only fitting that for my second Tales of timeline, I go back to the title which started it all and also serves as a sequel to the Symphonia story, Tales of Phantasia. Now, before I begin this video, I should preface things by saying, while it's not necessary, I would recommend checking out the Tales of Symphonia timeline I made before watching this one, as it is technically a prequel. While the majority of the story is not needed to understand Phantasia's timeline, at the very least, the beginning parts of that video that cover the origin of the world's history might be helpful going into this. So if it seems like I'm just jumping straight into the story without much world building before it, then know that the information does exist for you to check out. Also, I need to say this, because a true localization of Phantasia hadn't been made, there are tons of names and locations that aren't perfectly translated as they should be in the iteration that I'm playing. The fan translations have done an amazing job at translating the story and the plot, it's just the names that get iffy. Cress was known as Kless, Klaus was Klarth, and so on. But in the subsequent years, their official names have been cemented, so most of the footage you'll see in this video is using the translated names, but I will be speaking their official names. So don't be caught off guard if the name I say doesn't match the word on screen. Anyway, with that out of the way, I present to you the complete unabridged timeline of Tales of Phantasia. To start off this video, there's a few things that need to be set up that don't directly correlate to the story. For example, the planet of Aselia itself. It didn't go through many drastic changes after the events of Symphonia. For the most part, it is the exact same world from where that game left off, with some slight changes. First off, a handful of the more uncommon races seem to have more or less become extinct. These include the likes of the dwarves, who were the best blacksmiths, as well as the fairies. Even though we never really saw any fairies, they did exist, but no longer for the most part. As for the half-elves, Genis and Rain's journey to end discrimination against their kind was a success. Half-elves are widely accepted amongst the humans of the world. I say humans because the elves didn't change their mind. Pure-blooded elves still remain incredibly prejudiced towards the half-elves and see them as abominations for mingling with humans. Because of this, as well as a few other factors, the elves, who had ventured out and mingled around the world, retreated back to their village. There were many elves who didn't agree with their philosophy and wanted to stay part of the outside world, but everyone was forced back into seclusion. So pure-blooded elves have hidden away from the world once again, while half-elves are still spread everywhere. Aside from these few things, there's only really one major event that transpired, and that was the Ragnarok War. As Aselia flourished, the people went through an industrial revolution. They mastered machines, built skyscrapers, had TVs and bars. It was very much akin to our modern world, but much more advanced when it came to their technology. They even had supercomputers and were working on methods of time traveling. There were 3 major countries involved in this story: Fenrir, Odin, and Thor. The 3 countries lived in relative peace for some time, but eventually, Odin and Fenrir began engaging in open conflict with each other. Thor tried its best to maintain a neutral party and keep peace amongst the clashes, but realistically, Thor had its own problems. A comet was spotted in the sky and possibly heading directly towards Aselia. Scientists denied that it would reach them, claiming their supercomputers deduced that the comet's tail may graze the planet, but there is a 0 probability of a direct hit. It is unknown whether or not this was simply a lie to calm the people down, or whether the scientists' calculations were wrong, but regardless, the comet did hit the planet, directly impacting Thor, in fact, and sinking it to the bottom of the sea. Despite what you may think, the people did survive due to a powerful force field surrounding the kingdom, but at the bottom of the ocean, they had no resources, and eventually, everyone succumbed to starvation. As for the war that was going on, 3 mysterious individuals appeared during it. We don't know who they were or why they were even there, but each of them hailed from one of the 3 countries, each wielding one of the 3 pieces of the Eternal Sword. The blade Origin had crafted that could manipulate space and time. The blade was back into 3 pieces, and these 3 mysterious individuals used it to slaughter the remaining parties of Odin and Fenrir, putting an end to the war. After that, they disappeared and the story practically became legend. Phantasia's timeline truly begins a few thousand years after the events of Symphonia on Derris-Kharlan. The last time we saw it, Kratos had taken the planet and its people away from Aselia and into space to atone for his and Crucius's sins. Since then, life on Derris-Kharlan had flourished as any planet would. The people reproduced, kingdoms and countries arose, it became its own planet in every way. In modern day, everyone we know is now dead, so we can forget about them as we get introduced to some new characters. Most importantly is a man named Daus. He's the leader and prince of one of Derris-Kharlan's largest and most fruitful countries. Fortunately for its people, he was a very benevolent prince. He believed in a vision of peace and prosperity for everyone and valued diplomacy and dialogue as his main primary means of resolving conflict. He did not do this alone, however. By his side was his girlfriend Carrion and his council of sorcerers who all helped aid him on the right path. Fortunately, by being the leader of such a large country with power and influence, it deterred many of these smaller countries from waging war against one another, but it didn't stop all of them. A war between Pallas Gudora and Pallas Seidamu raged on. Dao sent a message to both sides telling them to stop the war due to all of the casualties. However, his words fell on deaf ears. His message was ignored and the war continued. Fortunately, in his eyes, there was a silver lining. Palace Ghidorah was slowly losing, and it was obvious that their loss was inevitable. Daus wouldn't have to intervene and thus wouldn't have to cause any more unnecessary bloodshed. But what he didn't know was what was happening behind the scenes in Ghidorah. Their army was led by a man simply known as General Bandy, and two of his most loyal and trustworthy soldiers were his adoptive children Melsha and Dios. Melsha had been secretly working on a weapon of mass destruction, a magic-powered mana cannon. I didn't mention this in the video, but if you're familiar with the lore, then you'd know that Derris-Kharlan also had its own world tree, which supplied its world with mana. In the Symphonia timeline, I said the elves had initially transplanted part of their tree and put it on Aselia to supply it with life. However, I think I had that part incorrect when in reality, they transplanted their entire world tree to the new planet. It was they who then cut off a part of the original and planted it back on Derris-Kharlan to grow a new world tree so the planet wouldn't die. But since it was already stable with mana, it would be safer to grow, and it did. It had its own tree spirit in the way of Norn. Anyway, all of that was to say, Derris-Kharlan was a planet that was thriving and was reliant on the use of mana. And a mana cannon is just about one of the worst things that can exist for this harmony. It absorbs as much mana as is available and weaponizes it. Even Mythos and his companions fought to stop the use of Magi technology being used for weaponry in order to preserve the mana of Aselia. But if history doesn't learn from its past mistakes, it only repeats itself. With an egotistical general on the losing side of a war, he throws all caution to the wind after 80% of the country's people and military are lost. He sees no future for their country since they have lost, and before dying, orders Dios to fire the mana cannon that Melsha had been working on. By the time he makes it to her, she tells him that it's not safe to fire yet, but Dios believes that there's no time and so fires it anyway. The consequences are devastating. 150,000 people are instantly killed in the surrounding area, including the likes of Dios and Melsha, but more importantly than that, Derris-Kharlan's world tree is also killed. The blast consumed so much of the tree's mana that it began to wither. Since mana is their life source, without it, Derris-Kharlan began living on borrowed time. The people would only last so long as it took for the tree to fully die. Due to the lack and ever-decreasing amount of mana after this event, the people were forced into an era of famine and death. Whole countries and populations fell, and it was obvious that the whole world would follow suit if action wasn't taken. There was really only one solution. If they wanted to save everyone's life, they had to restore mana to the planet. And the only way to do that was through a world tree. If they could obtain a mana seed from an already existing and healthy tree, then it could be used to restore their planet's mana flow. And fortunately for the people of Derris-Kharlan, they had recently discovered another planet that had its own world tree, Aselia. To be clear, they are not looking to steal Aselia's world tree. A healthy world tree is capable of producing a mana seed naturally, which can then be planted. It's in the natural life cycle of a healthy world tree. The current problem, however, was that Daus didn't want to do anything. After the incident, he blamed himself for the planet's situation as it was his lack of intervening that allowed this outcome. He had hoped to avoid bloodshed. He had hoped things would resolve themselves. It was his inaction of definitively stomping out the problem which led to this outcome and caused him to feel like he deserved to die with the planet he failed. It was only thanks to the encouragement of his girlfriend, believing that there was still hope, that he eventually agreed to help. But there was one more problem as it stood. There wasn't enough mana to transport Daus to Aselia. so Carrion, along with his council, sacrificed their own personal mana for the sake of hope. Daus entered a transportation capsule and, without his knowing, all of them supplemented their mana so he could travel through space and time a limited number of times, so he has more than one chance if need be. He is forced to watch all of them give their lives before he is transported to Aselia. The story that follows Daus's journey afterwards is detailed in a novel, which unfortunately hasn't been given an official English translation and doesn't have the most artwork to accompany it. So you'll have to forgive me if the details are a bit sparse and I don't exactly go the most in-depth when it comes to recapping the story in terms of its details. But the larger bullet points important to the story are all here. So after decades of traveling through space, Daus finally arrives on Aselia successfully. Due to the lengthy period of travel time, upon his arrival he is very weak and too exhausted to care for himself due to mana deprivation. Fortunately, he is found by a young woman named Winona Pickford. She's an archer, part of a traveling circus troupe of magicians. She's an excellent sharpshooter and uses her collection of bows to show off her talent. After finding his nearly catatonic body in the middle of the woods close to her home, Winona was kind enough to bring him into her house and nurse him back to health. She even introduced him to her friend Edward D. Morrison, who was a researcher of mana. He's very interested in how the state of mana seems to affect Daus's physical health, which doesn't leave a good impression on Daus. Due to his experiences, at some point Daus told Edward that if there is evil in this world, it lies in the hearts of men. A quote that was impactful enough for Edward to write it down in his journal. During his recovery, Daus's resolve only strengthens as he is plagued with images of his dying wife and followers. No matter what, he feels like he has no option but to obtain the mana seed to honor their sacrifice. Once his strength is regained, it isn't too long before quickly making his way to Aselia's world tree. But a problem quickly presents itself. For the tree to germinate and produce a mana seed, it requires a large amount of mana to do so. In an ideal and healthy world, this would theoretically be no problem. But Aselia was suffering from the same ignorance that Derris-Kharlan already had: Magi technology. An industrial revolution was currently inhibiting the world tree's mana flow and draining it faster than it could produce it. So not only was Daus's plan to obtain a mana seed halted, but Yggdrasil's life and the very existence of mana was at risk of extinction as well. Daus became determined to stop the development of Magi technology in the world and traveled to the kingdom of Midgards, acting as an emissary of peace in hopes to have an open-minded dialogue. While he tries to warn the king and his court of the dangers Magi technology presents, one of the king's closest advisors, Ryzen, who has been working on Magi technology and created Aselia's mana cannon, chooses to be a skeptic of Daus and his intentions. Sensing his unique aura, he believes Daus to be a demon in disguise, or perhaps simply just an enemy of Midgard's looking to weaken the kingdom's defenses. Due to Ryzen's intervention, Daus's pleas fall on deaf ears and he is unable to convince anyone to stop. In fact, the situation only worsened because of this interaction. Ryzen uses Daus's supposedly suspicious nature to further advance his own Magi technology funding and research. Now they believe there is a demon seeking to stop its production, which only further reinforces the idea in their head that a mana cannon is needed. Ryzen even goes so far to label him a demon king to tarnish his name and reputation. But not only that, because he believes him to be an actual demon, he launches several attacks on his life, which results in Winona, who has continued to be acquainted with Daus since she saved him, losing her arm. There was a dark injustice not only to him, but now innocent people that he cared about. So Daus decided to depart from the kingdom and sever his ties with Winona so she wouldn't have to walk the path that he knew he had to. It became more than evident that a peaceful approach was now impossible in saving the world's mana. While peace is always Daus's first option and the option he would normally choose to stick to, it was exactly because of this Derris-Kharlan is in the position it is now. If he wanted to change Aselia, he had to force Midgards to submit. No matter the cost, no matter the lives he had to take to do so, if he didn't stop the mana cannon, then his planet would die. So he decided to fulfill the role that Ryzen had already declared he was and become the Demon King. To fight an army, he needed an army of his own, and so made a contract with the demons of Daemonium, or as it was referred to in Symphonia, Niflheim. It's the world in which demons originated, but was subsequently sealed away so life could flourish on Aselia. Ever since then, they've always been seeking to return to the world, and in very small portions they have been. Under the leadership of Daus, the demons are able to organize and strengthen their influence, so they assist him. It should be obvious that the demons don't actually care about helping Daus achieve his goal. They're in it for themselves. They just both have the same enemy. Regardless, with their assistance, Daus was able to instill fear into the people of the world and would launch calculated attacks on cities and villages where Magi technology was being studied and developed. One such location was the village of Hamel. It's a relatively small and simple town, but it was the location of the Scarlet family. They are relatively famous when it comes to being researchers of Magi technology. The father of the family was a powerful mage who moved to the village a few years ago and taught various residents the art of magic. One such individual was a man named Demitel. He's a half-elf who, upon Daus's rise and conflict with Midgards began, had been recruited and joined his cause. By that, I mean the demons possessed him into being his subject. It's not uncommon that Daus will have a few humans possessed if it means furthering his cause. Oftentimes, it's actually a preemptive action to keep things from worsening. For example, the Prince of Alvanista, one of the other major kingdoms of the world, was similarly possessed. However, he only ever used him to blackmail the king into taking no action if a war ever broke out. As there is no Magi technology being developed, Alvanista had no reason to be destroyed. He also had a few ninjas from the ninja village possessed and used their expertise in stealth to keep eyes on developing situations without drawing attention. The village of Hamel was a different story. Because the Scarlet family was continuing their research, the family had to be dealt with. Demitel was given the order to assassinate the Scarlets. While he did so, and no one in the village suspected anything, he was confronted by their daughter Rhea, who knew the truth and sought revenge for his actions, which caused the spell he was under to lose control, which led him to killing both her and destroying the entire village. Undoubtedly, there were many innocent lives caught in the crossfire of Daus's mission. However, he found these casualties necessary and unavoidable if he truly wished to save his world. Ultimately, things only escalated between Daus and Midgards. Daus gave them an ultimatum. They were to stop all research and production on Magi technology immediately, or he would launch an all-out assault on the kingdom. Ryzen completely ignores his demands, instead taking the opportunity to show him the fruits of his labor. As such, war inevitably broke out in what would later be known as the Valhalla War. Once Daus and his demon forces took to the sky, Ryzen readied the mana cannon. While he was warned of the dangers it would have on the world's mana, he ignored these warnings and fired it twice. While it was extremely damaging to many of the demonic forces caught in the blast, it was ultimately more damaging to the World Tree as it died because of it. Yggdrasil lost all of its mana and withered away. Both the World Tree and all of the spirits connected to it died, eliminating magic from the world. But thanks to the events of Tales of Symphonia 2, mana, unlike Derris-Kharlan, is no longer needed to sustain life on Aselia. It was needed for the spirits and magic, but Aselia's people, unlike Daus's, can survive without it. Following this event, Daus's physical state deteriorates due to the lack of mana, and his mental state shatters as he has failed his entire planet and has nothing to fight for anymore. The best he can do is continue what he was already doing. He continues to fight in this war with Midgards, believing that they must pay for what they have done. Unfortunately, the mana cannon wiped out a significant portion of his demonic forces, but ultimately he did have the edge in the war now. It wasn't a significant takeover. In actuality, it was more of a war of attrition. Both sides fought with increasing casualties for over 5 years. Daus only grew increasingly maddened by his failures. He was a completely different person from when he started. Something had to be done. The war had lost its meaning. It was senseless killing with no signs of stopping. So 4 warriors rose up to the task. A wandering swordsman named Alan Albane, a cleric named Carol Adenade who had rediscovered healing arts after the Ragnarok War, along with 2 figures Daus was already familiar with, Edward Morrison, who was responsible for gathering everyone, and Winona Pickford. Winona has since grown in the years since she last saw Daus and is saddened to see him in the state he is now, so has offered up her bow skills to help put a stop to him. Together, the 4 stormed his castle and confronted him. Clearly having put up quite the fight, it is Morrison who puts an end to everything by casting the powerful spell Indignation, which manages to defeat Daus. To save his own life, he travels 87 years into the future where they will no longer be. While he does get away, at the very least, it puts an end to the Valhalla War in the present. It was definitely a great success for the 4 heroes, but it was clear that their mission wasn't over just yet. Knowing that Daus was destined to return one day, the 4 strove to ensure the future generations were ready. Alan Albane perfected his sword style and passed it down his family line, thanks to Carol rediscovering healing arts allowing both half-elves and humans to utilize them without mana. The Order of Clerics were founded. The unicorn became its symbol as it was the creature who aided Carol in creating these arts. Meanwhile, Edward and the Morrison lineage took responsibility for keeping an eye on Daus and planning for his return. As for Winona, neither her or her future descendants are documented after these events, leaving them a mystery. But all of that leads to 87 years in the future, in the year 4294 of the Asalian calendar, as Daus reappears. Sensing his return, the descendants of those heroes, Trinicus D. Morrison, Miguel Albane, along with his wife Maria Albane, who is taking the place of Winona's descendant, and Meryl Adenade, gathered together to stop him. Since magic was the only way of defeating Daus and it is gone in this time period, the 4 knew that they couldn't actually kill him. So they instead devised a plan that was going to eternally seal him away instead. Using 2 pendants, Daus was incarcerated within a coffin for the rest of eternity. Their plan was successful and Daus was sealed away. The Morrison family took responsibility to continue looking over him, while each pendant was put in the care of the others for protection. The Albane family took one half while Meryl had the other. Since Daus is fully conscious during his incarceration, what little sanity he may have had during this time is completely lost. And that leads us to the present timeline. 10 years have passed since Daus was sealed away, but that hasn't stopped him from making moves. Miguel Albane was initially the captain of Euclid's Order of Knights, but had since passed that role over to a man named Mars Uldol. His skills with a blade were comparable to Miguel's own, hence why he was held in such high esteem to become the new captain. But the key distinction lies in Mars's desire for power. Deep within his heart was an evil that was able to be exploited by Daus, who, from his containment, whispered promises of power if he released him. These mental nudges were enough to push Mars into acting in his favor, where he was able to be manipulated and controlled. He began excavating the catacombs to find the supposed Demon King and learnt that to release him, he must obtain the pendants that were used to seal him. So he sought out those responsible for Daus's imprisonment and enacted revenge. This involved killing many of the friends and family of Trinicus D. Morrison, as he wasn't able to find him himself. But the more important part was seeking out the pendants held by the Adenade and Albane family. Mars had successfully captured and tortured Meryl in the sewers of Usalid, obtaining her pendant in the process. He then led a force of knights to attack the village of Toltis, where Miguel and Maria currently resided. He slaughtered all of its citizens, leaving no one alive, including the likes of Miguel and Maria. The reason Miguel doesn't defeat Mars himself is because Mars takes Maria hostage, forcing him to give up his blade, but wasn't able to find the pendant as they no longer had it. That was because they entrusted it to their son, Cress. Cress at this time is 17 years old, and like his father and great-grandfather before him, has been practicing the Albane sword style since he was a little boy. Miguel had been training him so he could one day bear the burden of protecting the amulet, even though Cress doesn't know that yet. Unfortunately, that day seemed to have come much sooner than anticipated. On one unsuspecting day, Cress and his best friend, Chester Berklight, had gone to the nearby forest to hunt. Chester is an expert archer who has been making his living as a hunter. He has a sharp tongue, but a good heart. The forest they're hunting in is the same, in fact, where Yggdrasil is located. The decayed version, of course. Cress does hear the voice of Martel call out to him, asking that the tree not be defiled. However, he doesn't have time to think much about it because the village's alarm goes off. And of course, this was because Mars had come through and slaughtered everyone in his search for the amulet. By the time the two arrive, Mars's soldiers are gone and everyone is already dead. That is, with the exception of Cress's mom, who has been gravely wounded and only has enough strength to tell her son that they're after his amulet and he should flee to Usalid and seek safety with his uncle. She then dies in his arms. As for Chester, he too is devastated over these events as his little sister Ami was also killed. Their parents had died when they were little and the two have been living alone this entire time, with Chester looking after her. But now she was murdered in cold blood while he didn't even have the opportunity to protect her. So he wants vengeance on the man responsible. But he doesn't join Cress on his journey to Usalid immediately. He can't bear to leave the villagers like this and so takes on the responsibility to give them all a proper burial himself. The two promise to get their vengeance together, and Cress heads off to Usalid alone. Cress eventually makes it to his uncle Olsen and Aunt Joanne's house, where they seem more than kind enough, having heard word of what befell Toltis, and so offer him a place to stay. But when nighttime comes around and Cress is asleep, Mars's knights come in and apprehend him. Mars has blackmailed Olsen into giving up Cress, lest Usalid suffer the same fate as Toltis. After Cress is taken away, the knights kill Olsen. Cress is taken directly to Mars, who takes his amulet immediately and throws him in a dungeon to rot. With both halves of the amulet, Mars can finally free Daus from his confinement, and so he heads off to do so. But of course, we follow things from the perspective of Cress. With his equipment and items taken from him, there is nothing he can do from inside his cell. But that's when he hears a voice calling to him from the other side of the wall. She tells him to reach out his hand, which he does, and in it she gives him one of her earrings. She tells him to press it against the wall to escape and asks that he save her daughter. Cress obliges and is shocked to see that the woman he was talking to already dead and chained to the wall. This was, in fact, Meryl Adenade, who possessed the other half of the pendant that sealed Daus away. Unfortunately, she was already tortured to death and mortally wounded by a blade, but her spirit lived on and was able to at least help out Cress in the way that she just did. To honor her dying wish, Cress retrieves the sword from her body and rescues her daughter Mint, who was being held in the nearby cell. Mint is a very reserved but kind-hearted girl. Like her mother, she has devoted herself to the healing arts. While Mint wishes to see her mother as she heard her calling out to her, Cress shields her from the truth and grief of seeing her mother's corpse, and so instead lies to her, saying that no one was there and that they need to escape quickly. The urgency of the situation is enough to pull Mint's attention away to escaping. The two navigate through the underground aqueduct and manage to make it outside. Mint is then unexpectedly ambushed by an enemy, but Cress pushes her out of the way and takes the attack instead, falling unconscious. When he wakes up, he is in the house of Trinicus D. Morrison. He was initially pursuing Mars, but always seemed to be one step behind his actions. He caught wind that he was after the pendants and made his way to Toltis, but by the time he arrived, everything was already in ruin. In fact, that's when he ran into Chester, who re-enters the story. While Chester was burying the villagers, Trinicus showed up in hopes to save Miguel and Maria, but after seeing the whole village slaughtered, he helped bury everyone as well. After that, the two went to Euclid, where they ran into Mint, who was carrying Cress's unconscious body, which leads them all here. To be honest, Trinicus was hoping Cress was still in possession of his pendant, but when he tells him that Mars took it, he knew that he was set on releasing Daus. In hopes of honoring his now deceased companions, he refuses to take Cress and the others along with him and tells everyone to stay at the house as they are not strong enough, and so heads to the catacombs alone. While the group is confused, as Trinicus didn't really explain what was going on, our characters have no choice but to strengthen their resolve as they swore vengeance on Mars for destroying their village and killing their families. It is all they feel like they can do, and so the group makes for the catacombs as well. By the time they arrive, it is already too late. Morrison goes on to explain that it is pretty much their fate that they're all here and explains their history with sealing Daus. Chester honestly doesn't care all too much, as all he seeks is revenge. But while they're talking, Daus is finally released from his confinement. Mars immediately tries to command him and use his power for himself, but that was all just a lie. He was a puppet being used, and now he has outlived his usefulness, and so Daus first slaughters his men and then kills Mars as well. He then turns his attention to our group. Being the descendant of the people who sealed him away, they must pay for the actions of their ancestors. Since magic is the only way of harming Daus, our characters have no chance as is. So Morrison utilizes his clerical arts to time travel. Unfortunately, while he's casting the spell, Daus is getting ever closer, so Chester jumps in to buy them more time. Ultimately, Trinicus succeeds, but he is only able to send Cress and Mint 100 years into the past. Trinicus and Chester are then killed. Since we are now going back to the past, a lot of events that I've already explained are going to wind up repeating, just now with our characters getting involved and perhaps changing things. As stated, Cress and Mint are sent 100 years into the past, where Daus's influence and strength is at its strongest against Magitech. Trinicus had hoped that they could find some way to defeat him, and that way is through magic. This is a time where the World Tree has yet to be destroyed in the Valhalla War, so magic and mana is still a thing. After reading Trinicus's journal and fully comprehending the connection between their parents and Daus, it feels like it's their fate to stop him, so Cress and Mint vow to put an end to his terror. So first, they make their way to the nearby village. Toltis in the past is now Belladum Village. After speaking with the Elder and explaining their situation, he has to break the unfortunate news that only elves and half-elves can use magic, and they have since retreated back into their own village and stay out of human affairs, so their journey is pretty much frivolous. But he does tell them of a famous teacher who has been studying magic in hopes to one day find a way for humans to wield it as well. His name is Klaus F. Lester, and he lives in Euclid. He graduated the top of his class from the Royal Science Academy. While brilliant, he can be stubborn and arrogant. His thesis about summoning was rejected by the Academy, but he continues his research on his own. The body paint he wears is related to his summoning arts. So after spending the night in the Elder's house, Cress and Mint make their way to meet him. He certainly is an eccentric type who is quite blunt. He initially believes that the two are there trying to get free magic lessons out of him, and so becomes quite hard-headed as a result, not listening to their pleas. It's not until his assistant Merald comes in to ease the confusion in the room. She's Klaus's childhood friend who's been helping him with his research. Thanks to her, everyone sits down and Cress is able to explain their situation and hopes of defeating Daus with magic. While it's certainly a wild story for anyone to believe, thanks to the encouragement of Merald, Klaus instead uses the opportunity to potentially advance his research. Whether or not what Cress and Mint say is true, at the very least, if it's not, then he can get something out of it. So he agrees to help. Of course, he can't use magic either, as he is a human, but what he has been studying is the lost art of summoning. By utilizing the summoned spirits, a human can obtain a power equal to that of sorcery. It's not a common practice, as summoned spirits often reside in places where humans cannot easily tread, but that's where Cress and Mint come in. If they truly seek his assistance and the use of magic, then they will help him on his goal, which they ecstatically agree to. The first summoned spirit they seek is Sylph, the spirit of wind in the Lone Valley. They stop off at a man named Bart's house who's living nearby, who provides Klaus with the ring that he needs to form a pact with the spirit. But in return, he asks that they search for his daughter who has recently gone missing, Arche, as he believes she may have wandered into the valley to check on Sylph. He would go himself, but poisonous gas from the demonic realm, known as miasma, has been seeping out in the area, causing her to go berserk, making it incredibly dangerous. He asks that the party search for his daughter, which they agree to. Because of the aforementioned miasma, Sylph is out of control and thus a pact cannot be formed. So the characters work to plug the seeping gas in the area and calm them all down. As a thanks, Sylph gladly forms a pact with Klaus, but warns him of the mana disappearing from the world. She doesn't know why, but asks that they visit the World Tree and speak with the spirit Martel for answers. As for Arche, she is nowhere to be found. The characters then make their way to Yggdrasil, where Martel also says something is consuming large amounts of mana, of course referring to the mana cannon, and asks that they help her before she and all of the spirits die. While Klaus is skeptical at first, Cress and Mint confirm that the World Tree in their time is dead and mana is no longer a thing. Considering Daus is directly connected to everything going on, the characters come to the conclusion that if they stop Daus, that will in turn save the World Tree, thus killing two birds with one stone. So Klaus figures he needs the aid of the strongest summoned spirit in this universe, Luna, the spirit of the moon. But like all spirits, he needs the ring to form a pact, which is said to be in an old dwarven mine. But it's currently under the control of the Kingdom of Alvanista, so they need their permission. On their path towards the kingdom, our characters wind up passing through the village of Hamel, following the wake of Demitel's massacre. As previously covered, he assassinated the Scarlets due to their connection to Magi technology. But he was confronted by their daughter, Rhea Scarlet, where the magic he was under went crazy, resulting in this. As they make their way through the rubble, our characters run into Rhea Scarlet, or at least a girl claiming to be her. I'm not going to hold on to this mystery as long as the game does, but Rhea Scarlet is already dead. In actuality, this is Arche Klein, Bart's daughter that he asked us to look for. Arche and Rhea were friends. But after the destruction of Hamel, Arche used her skills in magic to allow the spirit of Rhea to possess her body and get revenge on Demitel. So our characters are currently talking to the spirit of Rhea in the body of Arche, though they don't know that. She tells them that Demitel was responsible for this and he killed her parents, and without any hesitation, Cress says that if she's looking to avenge them, then he will help her, and Mint agrees. The two relate heavily to the loss of their parents to some madman, and so they can't just leave someone in need like this when they see them. Klaus eventually gives in, and they all agree to get more information on Demitel to figure out where he is located. After heading to the nearby city and speaking to a few of the locals who used to know him, they say how about 1 year ago his personality completely changed and he moved to an isolated island to the west. After hiring a captain of a ship to take them there, Cress, Mint, and Klaus, accompanied by Rhea, all make their way through his mansion where they confront him in his main chambers. Demitel is relatively calm, all things considered, perhaps because he believes he can simply lie his way out of this situation, saying how it was all an accident that he had nothing to do with. But after learning the girl with our characters is claiming to be Rhea, he turns that information back on them as he is fully aware that the real Rhea died alongside everyone else. He claims that the girl is an imposter and advises everyone to leave. Rhea stays completely silent during this whole back and forth, but Cress still chooses to believe the girl, and the veil behind Demitel's facade slips away. He He's revealed to be one of Daus's minions, and so our characters engage him in combat. Demitel is inevitably killed, and Rhea's parents, along with all of the villagers of Hamel, have been avenged. Now having closure to her life, Rhea's spirit thanks Cress and the others before finally moving on and finding eternal peace. As for Arche, she has regained control of her body, and our characters are shocked to learn that she is Bart's daughter that went missing. Due to this happy coincidence, they all meet back at his place where he's happy to see his daughter alive and safe. But Arche is no longer the little girl that he has to worry about anymore. She's shown a desire to help others in whatever way she can, and that's exactly what she does. Arche decides to join our party and lend her magical aid in whatever way possible. Arche is a half-elf and thus is able to use true magic. Her naivety often leads her to express herself in blunt terms, but she does possess a more thoughtful side. With our 4 main party members collected, their sights are once again set to the kingdom of Alvanista. They charter yet another ship for their journey, but while on board, they meet a wandering swordsman named Mayer. He initially says that he's looking to gain access to the Moria mines, but after getting a little too drunk, he accidentally reveals his true intentions. Turns out he discovered that Alvanista is already under the control of Daus, as the prince is being controlled by one of his minions, and he intends to sell this information to the Adventurers Guild. Unfortunately, our characters are also a bit under the weather, having joined him in the festivities of drinking and eating too much, so no one really bats an eye when he says this. The problem is, this information is very valuable to Daus, and he doesn't need anyone spreading this rumor. So he has one of his minions seize control over Mayer's body and use it to try and assassinate our characters. After the death of Demitel, Cress and the others kind of made their presence known and put themselves on his radar. Which is why, in the middle of the night, Mayer's body tries to kill everyone. But Klaus wakes up from his drunken stupor to fend him off just long enough to protect Cress and tell him that he's being controlled. Cress chases him down and tries to get him to get a grip, but he is forced to act in self-defense as he is attacked. Unfortunately, Mayer is killed, and they are unable to save him. Having now learned of what's become of the prince, our characters yet again insist on helping out. The problem is, they simply can't walk up and say anything about it. They'd be arrested on the spot. So instead, Klaus proposes the idea of raiding the castle stealthily and finding Daus's minion themselves. They use Arche's broom to ascend the castle walls and sneak through the hallways without any guards noticing. Once in the prince's room, he immediately calls for the guards, forcing everyone to think quickly. They notice a strange parakeet nearby who reveals themselves as Jameer, the demon who's been controlling him. With her cover blown, she immediately tries to kill our characters, but is unsuccessful. The demon is killed and the prince is saved. Unfortunately, he's a bit groggy after the whole ordeal and doesn't quite know what's been happening, leading to the guards coming in and arresting everyone. Our characters are a little worried, but it isn't too long until they are summoned in front of the king. Of course, they already knew their son was possessed, but lacked the resolve to take action lest risk his life. After explaining their situation to everyone, the king comes to understand their intentions to fight back against Daus, and so offers to lend their aid in the upcoming war. I mean, the whole point of what Daus was doing, possessing the prince in the first place, was to keep Alvanista out of it, both for their safety and his convenience. But now he has lost that leverage. The king agrees to help out if a war breaks out, and gives our characters access to the mine as they initially wanted. The king's court magician Lundgrom also gives Cress the legendary spear of Gungnir, which Jameer had on her body. After heading to the Adventurers Guild to obtain the pass to access the mine, everyone makes it to the bottom where they encounter a slate written in the ancient language of the elves. Arche translates what appears to be some sort of riddle, which implies they need the 4 cardinal elemental summon spirits: earth, wind, fire, and water. Our characters already have Sylph, the spirit of wind, so they need to obtain the other 3. They ask around and gather information on where they are located, and one by one, Klaus makes a pact with Gnome, Ifrit, and Undini. It may seem like I'm skipping over story that would have taken place during their journey to collect these 3 spirits, but there honestly is no story that happens other than making a pact with them. So, with the cardinal spirits obtained, our characters return to the slate only to be met by Maxwell, the Lord of the 4 Elements. While it is an unexpected encounter, they need his help so they can obtain the pact ring needed for Luna. Like all the others, our characters need to prove themselves to him in battle. They do, and unexpectedly, Maxwell offers his aid as a summoned spirit as well, which Klaus gladly accepts. Past the slate is where everyone is rewarded with a treasure trove of items, but most importantly, they get both halves of the ring needed for Luna. Unfortunately, the ring is broken and thus cannot be used, so they need a way to fix it. They return back to Alvinista and tell Lundgrom of their problems, and he points them in the direction of Edward Morrison, one of the 4 who originally helped defeat Daus. But of course, that has yet to happen. In fact, that's what he's doing now. He's gone out in search of warriors to stand against him in an inevitable battle. His wife tells our characters where he's gone off to, and so they track him down to Olive Village. He's in search of basilisk scales for medicinal purposes, and he's not easy to get a hold of. So our characters collect the scales for him so they can lure him to them, which works. He thanks our characters for collecting the scales and throws Cress and Mint a bit off guard when he mentions that he is a Morrison. Of course, his future descendant is who saved them. Edward mentions that how since the rings were a collaborative effort between the dwarves and the elves, that elves would likely know how to fix it, so they should go to the Ymir Forest. Unfortunately, that's all he can help them with, and thanks them for their effort. He asks that they assist in the upcoming war before heading off. Cress, however, cannot sit idly by. The fact that he's Trinicus's ancestor is making him antsy, and so he runs off to tell him that they're from the future. Cress tells him about the time travel that he has yet to develop before Edward stops him in his tracks. He doesn't want to know the future, and what he's already been told is enough. But he understands Cress and his desire to change the future for the better, and he believes his heart is true. He promises to work hard on his own time travel research so he can send Cress and the others back to their time. Meanwhile, Cress promises to be at Midgard when the war breaks out. With that, they part ways. After returning back to Alvinista and telling Lundgrom of Edward's idea of the Ymir Forest, he says how it is a bit out there, but possible. He gives our characters an emblem which will grant access, however warns that half-elves are strictly forbidden, i.e. Arche cannot enter. So our characters agree to leave her behind for now and come back when they finish their business. But Arche has other ideas. She doesn't want to be left behind, and so she sneaks out and follows them without their knowledge. After traversing the forest and making their way to the hidden village, they are greeted by Brambert, the Lord of the Elves. Klaus jumps straight to the chase and asks if there's a way for them to fix the pact rings. Brambert says there is and brings them to Origin's slate. As the spirit of all things, his power is able to be manifested to return things to how they once were. And that's exactly what he does. Brambert fixes the pact ring needed for Luna and returns to the village. But when our characters return, there's a little commotion. Arche, who had been tailing everyone, has been caught and is set to be executed. It is law that half-elf trespassers are to be put to death without exception. But unexpectedly, it is a mysterious woman who comes out and pleads with Brambert to let her go, even offering to take her place. The woman, in actuality, is Arche's mother, Luce. She and Bart once experienced a loving relationship that was generally smiled upon by both races at the time. However, as history went, the elves soon developed a great animosity towards humans and chose to isolate themselves once again. Not all elves agreed with this isolation, but it eventually became mandatory. The elves forcefully ended Luce and Bart's union by taking her away. Luce requested that Bart hide the truth of their separation, so Bart led Arche to believe that her mother had passed away. Brambert recognizes what's happening and so lets Arche go. Luce desperately apologizes to her daughter, and Arche realizes that she is her mother, but the elves take her away before they can speak. The revelation of this fact hit Arche a bit too late, as she is held outside the village boundaries, unable to see her mother again. With the packed rings in hand, our characters make their way to the Tower of the Zodiac, where Luna resides. Unexpectedly, she does not desire a fight like all the others. In fact, she would prefer not to take part in any battle, and under different circumstances, she would have refused a pact. But she understands that if she does not fight against Daus, then the world will be destroyed. So she lends her aid to Klaus as a summon spirit. With Luna at their aid, our characters feel comfortable enough to stand against Daus and his forces, and so make their way to where everything stems, Midgard. Morrison is happy to see that we have shown up and introduces us to Ryzen, the captain of the guard and the man responsible for the mana cannon. Together, everyone stands in front of the king, who is happy to welcome any willing and able soldiers to fight alongside them. As they are allies, Ryzen shows our characters the research facility where they've been working on ways for humans to use magic. An appealing idea on the surface, but of course this is what led to the creation of the mana cannon. While it definitely sounds very attractive to the likes of Klaus, Arche has second thoughts about everything that's happening. She's the only one really questioning Daus's motivations and reasons for acting against only Midgard. Kress doesn't see things so complex. He holds quite a grudge against him for the death of his parents, but Arche suggests they return to her house so they can see if her dad knows anything about this. And she has her own problems to confront him on. First things first, Arche talks about the whole situation with her mom, forcing Bart to come clean about how they were torn apart, giving her a better understanding. Secondly, they ask him about why Hamel was destroyed and if there was any connection to Midgard. He mentions the Scarlet family and how they were originally from there and how they were involved in some secret project, which we already know was Magi technology. While it doesn't change our characters' motivations, it does instill doubt into their heads. When the party returns to Midgard, a situation is unfolding. Daus's minion, Justona, is holding a child hostage at the castle as a welcoming to the war. Edward manages to teleport behind the demon and free the child, but is stabbed in the process. Edward then uses the last of his strength to cast a spell, resulting both of them disappearing from history. As Edward is no longer around to defeat Daus, the party must take his place. With that, the war plans begin unfolding. Even Klaus is made captain of a special forces unit consisting of our characters. And with that, the stage is once again set for the Valhalla War. But now, history has changed. Edward is gone, and our characters stand in their ancestors' stead. Everyone contributes in their own special way. Kress is on the front lines putting his swordsmanship to the test, Klaus and Archie are using their respective magical abilities to fend off the hordes from a distance, and Mint is healing the injured with her clerical arts. They successfully push back the demon hordes, which inevitably leads to an offensive aerial push by Daus. This is what triggers the use of the mana cannon by Midgard. As history goes, Ryzen is warned of the dangers, but ignores them. In the original history, the mana cannon was fired twice, which led to the destruction of the World Tree. But this time, the cannon only goes off once before it breaks down. Thanks to Kress and the others lending their aid, as well as an unexpected plotline where a character named Valkyrie shows up because Kress has the Gungnir and she wants it back, so lends him the aid of Pegasus so he can fight off the enemies in the sky as well, likely resulted in the mana cannon only being operable once. Yggdrasil doesn't die. It's greatly wounded, but it's not killed. Either way, because Kress slew their leader, the demonic forces lost their leadership and had to retreat, leaving Daus's castle wide open. So Kress, Mint, Arche, and Klaus all storm his castle and confront him directly. Of course, since Daus hasn't lost his mind in this timeline, he has no desire to fight our party. If they have no involvement in what's going on with Magitech, then his quarrels are not with them. But Cress has his own reasons, as does everyone else. Even if they don't understand Daus's motivations, they still believe they have to stop him. So he is forced to fight. Ultimately, Daus is defeated. However, similar to how he lost in the original timeline, he uses time travel to escape. But he doesn't travel to the era where he was originally captured. He travels 50 years past then, 150 years into the future from where our characters currently are. And with Daus gone, there is no major threat to the world anymore. While an undeniable victory on behalf of our characters, their journey still wasn't done. Stopping Daus was one thing, but saving Chester and Trinicus was still Cress's priority. So they still need a way to get back to the future. Fortunately, before his disappearance, Edward had done some digging. While he didn't reinvent time travel as he said he would, he did learn that the ancient city of Thor had developed their own method of time travel before it sank to the bottom of the ocean. So if they can get to Thor, they can travel back to their time. Fortunately, they possess the power of Undine, so making it to the bottom of the ocean is actually no problem for them. But before they head off, Mint asks something of everyone. She asks that they heal Yggdrasil before they leave. Since mana is needed to defeat Daus, they need to ensure that the World Tree doesn't wither away like it originally did. So everyone visits the World Tree. Mint tries to use her clerical arts to heal it, but her power just isn't enough. Stumped about what to do, everyone turns in for the night, and during her sleep, Mint has a dream of her mother. In it, they talked about her earrings and how they were in the shape of a unicorn, the mark of the healer for which all healing arts originated. So Mint gets the idea to seek help from a unicorn. Our characters support her decision, and after asking around and gathering information on one of these fabled creatures, it eventually leads them to the White Birch Forest. However, considering the unicorn will only be seen by a pure maiden, Cress and Klaus have to sit out. As for Arche, she winds up panicking as she is not pure, leaving Mint to meet the unicorn alone. Much to her surprise, it really does exist. But while Mint is explaining their situation, Daus's minions attack. Cress and Klaus rush over to Mint's location, but the unicorn has been gravely wounded. After dealing with the demons, the unicorn is able to see Mint's pure heart and so gifts her its horn, which will amplify her powers. With it, the group return to Yggdrasil, and Mint uses the strongest healing art she's ever performed. She's barely able to contain the power, but holds on long enough to restore the tree to its natural glory. With that, Martel thanks them and says how the tree will be able to live strong for ages to come, but warns that there has been no change to whatever was altering the flow of mana. In other terms, Magitech is still a thing. With that, Martel disappears. She is still a spirit and cannot retain physical form for too long. Regardless, our characters did what they sought to do. They restored the World Tree, and mana will now exist in their original time. And so, with that, our characters set off to Thor. As previously hypothesized, thanks to the power of Undine, getting to the bottom of the ocean is a breeze. After obtaining an access card, the characters make their way to the central computer which controls all of the city's functions. They use it to first raise the city out from the bottom of the ocean and back to the surface, before using its time travel function to return back to their time. Now, before I go any further, I need to explain that the logic of time travel here doesn't exactly make much sense in terms of what it's going for. Tales of Phantasia is dealing with parallel worlds, and going back in time to do something differently from how it was supposed to happen will just cause the person to end up in a different parallel world, thus making it impossible to actually change history. But the problem here is that it both does and doesn't do that. Cress and the others change the past in a few major ways, all of which are important to the other. First is the World Tree. They used the unicorn horn to heal it, thus mana now exists in the future as the tree is alive and healthy. And by doing that, Daus never goes insane. He went mad when, in the original history of events, the mana cannon killed the World Tree. After that, his goal failed and he swore revenge on humanity as his planet died. So now that doesn't happen and Daus is sane. In fact, he was defeated much sooner now by Cress and the others, and he time traveled to the future. So now there's a whole period of history where Daus is missing from. Due to the parallel worlds, Cress isn't wiped from history as now a new adjacent world has been formed. These are drastic changes that would affect how history plays out, despite Morrison having now disappeared before he, Winona, Alan, and Carol were assembled to stop the out-of-control Daus. Instead of jumping to the future at the new point in time that they've created, they jump to the future of a history that no longer should exist. Cress, Mint, Klaus, and Arche return to the original point of their history, where Daus was sealed because he went mad. And that Daus is still there even though he shouldn't exist anymore. Despite being a parallel world, this moment should not have repeated. The logic just isn't there, but we're just going to have to accept it for the sake of the plot. So as stated, the characters travel to the exact moment that they left when Chester and Trinicus were about to be killed by Daus. But now, thanks to their effort, the World Tree is alive and they can utilize magic to defeat him. The evil Daus is slain, our characters escape, and the catacombs collapse on top of him, burying everything with it. It seems like an overwhelming victory on behalf of our characters. They saved the past and thus were able to save their friends in the present. So it's time for Klaus and Arche to say their goodbyes and return to their time. But just as they're getting ready to leave, a meteor strike rains down on the surrounding area. This is of course Daus's doing, the Daus from the future trying to kill our characters in the present. Just then, a new character named Harrison arrives from 50 years in the future because they need our party's help. He tells them all about how Daus arrived in their time and is threatening the world once more, so our characters have no choice but to go to the future and face him once again. Chester, refusing to be left behind, joins our party, and together they all once again return to Thor to utilize its time travel technology to travel 50 years into the future. This is where the new Daus traveled after his defeat during the Valhalla War. But unlike the other iteration of him, he didn't lose the World Tree and thus doesn't have the all-encompassing hatred for being sealed for a full decade. So all he's set on is to continue his goal of getting the Mana Seed. In the years since he disappeared, Magi technology had flourished, and Daus attempts to destroy it all once more. He hid his base behind a space-time barrier so none can approach him as he continues to attack the world, though he's careful not to strike near the Forest of Spirits where Yggdrasil lies. He also occasionally watches over Martel, frequently checking up on her, ensuring her well-being. When the party travel to the future, they can find him by the tree, but Daus refrains from combat in order to prevent any damage to it. As for the characters, this time around, fortunately, they don't have to go through the hassle of proving themselves as they've already gone down in history for having defeated Daus during the war. For that reason, the king and all of their resources are open for our characters to use. These include the likes of the Rayards, which the Symphonia cast even used before. Since then, the technology had been lost to time, but a scientist named Stanley has spent his time researching and reinventing them. But the same problem still faces them. They just don't have enough power for prolonged flight. And so, the solution is the same as before, to utilize the power of Volt, the summoned spirit of lightning, to provide a constant powerful energy source. So our characters head to Volt's location to forge a pact. But unexpectedly on their path, they run into a young ninja named Suzu Fujibayashi, likely a descendant of Shina's, who hails from a long line of ninjas. As the granddaughter of the village chief, she is considered next in line to lead. She has a calm and serious demeanor because ninjas are taught to suppress their emotions. She has tracked down some of her fellow ninjas that have been taken control of by Daus in hopes to bring them back to their village. However, due to being controlled, Suzu is often forced to fight and kill them. Our characters bear witness to this and even try to help out on occasion. But it seems each and every time, Suzu is forced to strike them down. She is a bit shy and reserved, so not much conversation is had. At the very least, she does introduce herself before running off. with nothing else to do, our characters continue further in and form a pact with Vault and gain access to the Rayards, making their travel much easier. From here, there are tons of side stories that take place, a lot of which aren't too important. Our characters form pacts with the few summoned spirits still left, Aska and Shadow being the most prominent. Arche's mom gives her daughter a broom and some gloves for not being able to be with her, but probably the most significant one has to do with Suzu. When venturing into the Ymir forest, they encounter her once again. In no small part thanks to their kindness earlier, the village leader and Suzu's grandfather, Ronzo, has a favor to ask of our characters. Suzu's parents had recently gone missing, and they believe Daus and his mind control to be the culprit. So he asks that we track them down and find them. On their adventure, they are unexpectedly encountered in Euclid's tournament as its top fighters. It is clear that they are being controlled and are attempting to break it, but to no avail, as Cress is forced to fight them off. Uncertain of what to do against them, in the middle of the fight, Suzu appears before them to try and talk them back to their senses. But the demon controlling them is a bit too powerful to break free entirely. Instead, Suzu's parents only gain a moment of control over their bodies and use the opportunity to strike each other down. They didn't want Suzu to stain her hands with having to kill her own parents, but in a weird way, they are happy to see Suzu shed tears over losing them as they feel they are undeserving. They tell their daughter that a ninja must hide their heart and not show any emotions before disappearing. Suzu tries to heed their advice and not cry in front of everyone, and so thanks Cress for finding them before vanishing herself. When returning back to the village, Ronzo thanks the party but has one last favor to ask of everyone. He asks that they take Suzu along on their journey, and Suzu confirms this sentiment. Finding her parents was her only goal, but now that that's gotten a resolution, she wants to not only return the favor, but fight for the fate of the world as well. Following this, Suzu also undergoes a trial to prove she is worthy to become the next leader of the ninja village. She undergoes training in the Cave of Tribulations, where she answers multiple questions about the ninja code while fighting 5 foes respectively. Ultimately, she completes the trial and at the end finds a letter from her father congratulating her for the success, but saying that she still lacks one thing. And if she finds out what it is, then only then will she be ready to become the next chief. But speaking of training, I haven't exactly been mentioning him on this journey since he was saved, but Chester has really been pushing himself after the events with Daus. He has seen that Cress has grown so much and feels that he's fallen behind quite a bit, and so he's been working hard to keep up with him. Cress, being his friend, encourages him along the way. Anyway, with that, the main story continues. Our characters travel to the kingdom of Alvinista to speak with its current king. The whole reason our characters have been brought to this time specifically is because they feel like they have discovered a method of putting a stop to Daus once and for all. And that is the Eternal Sword, the blade that can manipulate space and time and thus can stop Daus from time traveling. It was the 3 artifacts that the mysterious 3 heroes wielded to end the Ragnarok War: the Diamond Ring, the Flamberg, and the Vorpal Sword. When combined, they make the Eternal Sword. Our characters already have the Diamond Ring, as the security system in Thor had dropped it when defeating its defense mechanism. All that's left is to find the other 2. Fortunately, doing that isn't quite so hard. The kingdom of Fenrir once stood where the city of Freezekill now stands, and the only remnant from that era is a temple to worship its god Fenrir. The guardian of the Vorpal Sword is known as Fenbeast, and apparently the soul of her master resides within the blade. She is determined to protect it, but after Cress and the others defeat her, they are proven worthy and obtain the sword. As for the Flamberg, that also resides in a structure where the final ancient kingdom, Odin, once stood. Similarly, the god Odin supposedly resides within the blade, and after defeating its guardian, they obtain the Flamberg as well. With all 3 pieces of the Eternal Sword obtained, they travel to Origin to return it to its original state. Since the seals of Flame and Ice have been broken, Origin himself challenges them to a fight to prove their worth. Like all, he is defeated and so grants our characters their wish of restoring the Eternal Sword. He then forms a pact with Klaus. With blade in hand, our characters are finally able to take the battle to Daus once and for all. The only problem that currently remains is his base. Unlike the last time, he's not residing in a castle so easily found. This time, he's hidden it within time and space itself. It's there, but it can't be seen or reached by natural means. But this is where the Eternal Sword comes in, to mitigate these tricks. His castle currently resides over the city of Arli. It's been blanketed in unnatural darkness for many years now, and Daus's hidden castle is the cause of it. So our characters make their way for the city and prepare for their final battle. There's a few character moments that go on here, so I'll go through each one individually. Cress and Mint have obviously grown incredibly close over this entire adventure. Not only does it seem like their destiny to fight against Daus as their ancestors have over and over again, but they also bond greatly due to the loss of their parents. They've lost the people that they've cared most about, but instead of feeling isolated and lonely over everything, they've found friends and comrades to share in their feelings. Cress and Mint have so much in common in terms of what they've been through and how they were the only two sent back in time. Mint takes the opportunity to show Cress her mother's earring, the same in fact which was used to save him from his cell. Mint knows that her mother is dead, but thanks Cress for shielding her from the truth at the time. Had he been honest, she does not believe that she would have been able to go on, but she has since found the strength and resolve to continue forward. Klaus in his free time asks Origin for a special one-time favor. Due to his power, he can see events during any era throughout history. While Origin refuses to show the future, what Klaus wants to see is the past. He uses the power to check on Merald to make sure she's doing alright. What he sees is her continuing her teachings in magic while he's away. She also says how she trusts that he'll return and awaits his arrival. Meanwhile, Suzu stands atop of the inn's roof and questions the ninja's resolve not to feel. She asks her parents if that makes her weak, but she resolves to stand by her friends and fight with her heart in order to live without regrets. Meanwhile, Chester and Archie bounce between the different events going on while being a little flustered with each other. While it's not a full-blown romance blossoming between them like Cress and Mint, Chester and Archie do have more of a crush on one another, though neither would admit it. After this, the characters are finally able to venture off on their final battle. They use the Eternal Sword to pull Daus's castle out from hiding and battle their way through his chambers. When they come face to face with him, Mint questions him about his motives. For some reason, all Daus reveals is his vendetta against Magi technology. Unfortunately, being incredibly vague about his goal doesn't sway Cress and the others, forcing everyone to fight. After going through his natural form, transforming into a grotesque monster, and finally being granted a blessing of the gods from his homeland and taking on an angelic appearance, Daus is ultimately unable to best our party of warriors. It is only after his defeat and on his deathbed that he divulges the true nature of his objective to everyone, about his goal to save Derris-Kharlan. But in the end, despite everything, Daus is slain. Our characters come to understand that the situation was much more complex than they initially thought. They acknowledge Daus was acting nobly, but don't regret their actions either, as they too had people they wanted to protect. Nevertheless, everyone does feel the need to honor Daus's conviction, and so Mint casts a barrier over Yggdrasil, which prevents too much mana from ever being drawn from the tree, meaning one day a great seed can be produced and Daus's soul can rest in peace. With their mission complete, everyone says their goodbyes and returns to their respective times. Suzu is the first one to leave, as she is already in her respective time. While it's a ninja's duty never to show emotion, she refrains from crying, wishing to keep their goodbye a happy memory. As for the others, Klaus returns home and continues teaching magic with Merald. Archie ventures into the Ymir forest to reconnect with her mother. Meanwhile, Cress, Mint, and Chester all vow to rebuild Toltis together, and visit Archie since she's still alive, being a half-elf and all. However, there is a happy ending to this story after all. Thanks to the efforts of Mint, Martel has enough mana to create a seed. Martel deems Daus's motives just and so creates the mana seed he so desired, and sends it, along with his body, back to Derris-Kharlan, giving that planet another chance at life. And thus, Tales of Phantasia comes to an end. But that's not the end of the timeline just yet. The story does vaguely continue in Tales of Phantasia Narikiri Dungeon, which was released 5 years later on the Game Boy Color. But unlike the main title, this one unfortunately hasn't been translated, not even fan-wise, making the story a bit more difficult to give a full recap of. Also, the footage you'll be seeing is from Narikiri Dungeon Cross, which was the PSP remake of the game, as I think it looks aesthetically better. Also, I feel like I should address this. The Cross version of this game and the original introduced a completely new character named Rondoline E. Effenberg, or Rhodey. She is very much considered a non-canon character when it comes to the official story and timeline of Tales of Phantasia, or at least her involvement has to be relegated to an alternate timeline, because working her in is very fickle. To give you a very brief synopsis on who she is and what her story was looking like, in her iteration of the timeline, she had been raised in the Forest of Spirits where Yggdrasil resides by her adoptive father. One day he left for Midgards to work on the mana cannon and never returned. Rhodey, living in the forest, eventually ran into Daus, who was constantly visiting the World Tree checking up on it. Eventually, the two became really good friends, and Daus even taught her how to use magic. She really looked up to him and respected him, and he even gifted her a magical ring one day. Eventually, as the story went, Daus had to travel to the future after being defeated, leaving Rhodey alone once more. But the ring that he gave her allows her to time travel, so she followed Daus to the future and learned of his persona as the Demon King. She didn't believe it was really him and so went on a quest to confront him. She even joins Cress and the others on their journey, but is constantly being thrown through time by accident, but her story doesn't get a resolution, so she is consistently at different points in the story, contributing to the events with our characters sometimes, but at the end of the day, winds up contributing nothing. There is no real resolution to what she wants to do or the purpose she serves. She's kinda just on her own mission in a storyline that doesn't amount to much anyway. So her inclusion more so makes things convoluted while not adding much, if anything, in the process. So just so you know, that's who she is, but if you're really more curious about her, feel free to wiki dive to get her full story, or play the games. As for the actual story of Narikiri Dungeon, it revolves around the bit of lore I covered at the very beginning of this timeline, on Derris-Kharlan, how their world tree died due to the war, and the two important characters that were involved in their fate. Melcia, who had built the mana cannon, and her brother Dios, who had fired it. Now, they were both killed once the mana cannon went off, but their story doesn't end there. Norn, who is the summoned spirit of Derris-Kharlan's world tree, decides to judge whether or not the two are inherently evil. Arguably, they are to blame for what befell Derris-Kharlan. But was it because it's who they truly are deep down, or was it simply an unfortunate outcome that could have gone differently? So Norn resurrects the two as babies with no prior knowledge of who they were. Their new names were Dio and Mel. If it turns out they are incapable of facing the past and grow up once again to be evil, Norn will kill them. They are sent down to the planet of Aselia as babies so they could grow up naturally. But of course, Norn couldn't just leave them as toddlers to fend for themselves. She needed a caretaker. This is where Ethos comes in. She believes herself to be the sole survivor of the ancient race of fairies and has been wandering the world alone in search of others. After a long period of traveling, she lost her power, but was saved and nursed back to health by Norn. Norn had asked her to care for Dio and Mel as their adoptive mother, and as a thanks for saving her life, Ethos agreed to this. The truth about Ethos, however, is not what I just said. She is in fact not a fairy. While she doesn't know this just yet, the truth is she is the spirit of sound who had her memories taken away by the other spirits as a consequence of her misdeeds from the past. She too is in a similar situation as Dio and Mel to see whether or not she can change. To prove this, she was delegated as the two's mother figure. As you can probably begin to pick up, this game is more so about its themes than a much grander story. The story begins 13 years later in the year 4408 of the future timeline, where Daus was truly defeated. Mel and Dio have obviously grown since then. Mel is a kind and quiet girl. She is prudent above all else and always has a reprimand at the ready for when Dio crosses the line. In contrast, Dio is a very spirited young man, eager to face any challenge head on. But his rash behavior is a constant source of stress for his sister. The plot comes in when the two are visited by Norn, who tells them that they have a doomed destiny and that they must complete the Ordeal of Spirits. The details the two are given aren't much to go on, and Norn is being purposefully cryptic and deceptive at that. Dio winds up running into a strange green bipedal creature who the two decide to keep as a pet and name it Courier. But the truth is, this is the physical embodiment of Norn, and she's using this form to keep a watch over Dio and Mel's ordeal directly. But as far as the two are concerned, it's just their new pet. The Ordeal of Spirits is meant to see if the two can truly understand the past actions committed by those before them and what it means to carry the weight of those decisions. And what better way to learn than from the heroes of eternity as they have been come to be known by. The first person they meet is Arche, who Norn enlists the assistance of. She's now 223 years old and lives in a witch's tower. She helps prepare the trial that will test the strength of Mel and Dio's bodies and heart. But as will become a common theme of this game, part of the reason for their visit is for the two to see the characters and understand what they've been through after everything. Being a half-elf who's been alive for so long, Arche's a bit lonely and missing her friends. But after their visit with her and proving their strength, they are given a painting which functions as a portal so they can travel back in time and meet Klaus. A year has passed since the events of the game, and he continues to teach magic with Merald at his side. He meets with Mel and Dio and recounts the events of their war with Daus. He first tells the pair the popular version of the story, but reminds them that history is biased and goes on to tell them his own interpretation. Klaus still believes that Midgard's was not as perfect as history claims, and that he does not believe Daus was an inhuman monster. History is an important thing, but it is easily more nuanced than many will make it seem. Following this throughout the game, Mel and Dio join forces with the former heroes and gain words of wisdom from the summoned spirits, but these are largely besides the point. The real lessons here come from meeting the characters. After their business with Klaus is over, yet another painting is enchanted, allowing them to travel so they can meet Chester, Cress, and Mint. The first character they run into is Chester, who has since opened up and now runs an orphanage. At Norn's request, he tells them about why he's doing what he's doing. He tells Mel and Dio about how the death of his sister and the slaughter of his village at the hands of Mars affected him and his emotions. He doesn't want any disadvantaged children to turn to an immoral lifestyle, wrongly attempting to justify their actions by blaming others as he once did. He then points them to the direction of Maxwell, seeing that Cress isn't around at the moment. Maxwell gives the two a lecture in the concepts of time and space. He says that possibilities create parallel worlds, and going back in time to do something differently from how it was supposed to happen will just cause a person to end up in a different parallel world. Thus, it is impossible to change history. They then finally meet Cress, who relates the shock he felt of learning the truth behind Daus's true motives. He doesn't regret what he did standing against him, but he does regret that he wasn't able to see things from his point of view before it was too late. He even acknowledges that from the people of Derris-Kharlan's point of view, he was the destroyer of their last hope. And finally is Mint. Norn describes her as a great healer due to her role in restoring Yggdrasil, as well as the obvious of being a cleric. But Mint rejects the title, as while she may be able to heal people's bodies, she cannot heal their hearts. She goes on to impart some wisdom on Mel and Dio, telling them that living for others, even if it's just one person, can bring happiness, as it's how she found her own. In contrast to Mint's message of love, Gremlin Lair, an evil spirit from the demon world, tells them about evil. More specifically, how good and evil are two sides of the same coin and cannot be separated. Meanwhile, Asuka tells them to believe in their own potential. The only person left from the Heroes of Eternity is Suzu, so after traveling to the era, we get to hear what she gained by meeting all of the others. She talks about how she was a child in both body and heart back then, but she has learned about what it means to become an adult. Both meeting and separating from various kinds of people and the struggles of saying goodbye and moving on is what taught her to become more mature so she could properly lead her clan. She tells them that the relationships between people are strange things, possibly the work of fate or something that needs to be sought, and wishes them a wonderful encounter. Back with the summoned spirits, Shadow tells them about the balance between light and dark. Mel and Dio's trial ends after being tested by Origin and Pluto. After returning to their time, Norn ultimately asks them if they understand why they exist, to which the two respond that they don't. Afterwards, an earthquake opens up a cave nearby, for which Mel and Dio investigate. In it, they are confronted by their true selves, but Norn tells them that there is no such thing as a true self. Further into the cave, Mel and Dio, accompanied by their alternate selves, see scenes of the original characters suffering with their problems while their evil sides commentate. Chester is reminiscing about his dead sister Ami, and Melsha wonders whether he runs an orphanage for the sake of others or for his own sake. Klaus is worried about becoming too much like his own father, whom he hated for being too involved in research to spend time with his family, and Merald comforts him. Dios notes the similarities between love and hate, but asks who those without parents are supposed to emulate. Arche, who has a long lifespan, misses all of her human friends, especially Chester, and Dio says that separation is too painful, so one may as well never become attached to someone anyway. Suzu is shown being forced to kill her parents, and Melsha says that no one understands the darkness in Suzu's heart, perhaps not even Suzu herself. Cress is giving his support and love to Mint, who is recovering from an illness, and Dios criticizes her because she is needed by many people and doesn't understand what it means to be unloved. Near the end of the cave, Mel and Dio fight Melsha and Dios, who remind them that this violates the principles of cause and effect and creates a paradox because they've killed their past selves. In the end, they become one with their dark sides again. Now, having grasped the extent of who they once were, what they did, and becoming one with that darkness again, it is finally time for Norn herself to test them. She unveils that she was courier the whole time, and Mel and Dio fight to prove their worth. They overcome Norn's final judgment and disappear after being corrected by the flow of time. The game ends with Ethos having come to love motherhood and adopting several more children, effectively turning her house into an orphanage. And Dio and Mel are also there, showing that they get to live their lives as changed people. Tales of Phantasia may not have been the game anyone expected it to be. With so much having changed from the original vision, it's almost a miracle that it managed to tell a cohesive story, and one that was successful and popular enough to not only warrant more games after, but spawn an entire 30-year franchise following it. The Tales of series has done what many developers can only dream of, but in this case, it wasn't just a dream that became a reality, it was a true fantasy.